little alien girl's starved belly bloated as she lay dying in the rubble-strewn streets of her war-ravaged world, not knowing an old human soldier would soon defy his own military to save her frail life. In the year 2257, a weary war veteran named Brian Mason stumbled upon the desperately malnourished orphan named Raxor while patrolling the deadly slums of the recently conquered alien planet. The 8-year-old Trill's parents had been killed in the brutal conflict between the militaristic human forces and the pacifist Trill. At first, Brian eyed the emaciated alien child with wary distrust, his soldier's instincts warning him. But as he watched Raxor's chest weakly rise and fall, so close to taking her final breath, something deep inside compelled him to act, overriding a lifetime of training and indoctrination against the enemy Trill. Brian had seen too many innocent lives cut short by the indiscriminate brutality of war. He wouldn't let this one flicker out, not if he could help it. The grizzled soldier made a choice that would shatter all protocols and risk everything. Brian covertly scooped up Raxor's limp form, wrapping her in his camo jacket, and decided to smuggle the alien orphan back to the human ships. If he pulled this off, he could get her real food, medicine, a warm bed, a chance. But discovery would mean the end of his career and freedom, possibly his life. The Earth military didn't take kindly to personnel harboring the enemy, even a half-dead little girl. As Brian cautiously darted down the deserted, rubble-choked streets with his precious illegal cargo, he reflected on the utter senselessness of this planet-wide conflict and how it left orphans like Raxor to slowly perish, forgotten casualties discarded in the wake of two violently colliding species. He silently vowed that he would find a way to get her to safety, even if it meant turning traitor and smuggler. Compassion had forced his hand, for better or worse. Blending in with the squads of patrolling soldiers, Brian subtly angled toward the base perimeter where his ship waited in the hangar. He had to rely on his wits and decades of combat experience to slip past the security checkpoints with Raxor concealed in his pack. There would be tense close calls and risky improvisations ahead. If Brian could navigate the dangerous battle-blasted cityscape and reach his ship undetected, they just might make it. He owed this innocent child that much. Failure wasn't an option, but the stakes were astronomical. Not only was he risking court-martial and life imprisonment, but hidden psionic powers just starting to manifest in the extraordinary Trill girl could soon redirect the course of the raging interplanetary war. Powerful forces on both sides sought to seize and weaponize Raxor's raw abilities for their own agendas. An extinct species' forbidden genetic tinkering could now shape the future of both Trill and human civilizations. But only if Brian could somehow spirit Raxor to safety on an Earth hostile to her very existence. Taking that first step toward his ship, Brian's heart pounded in his ears, every instinct screaming to turn back before it was too late. The point of no return. Raxor's frail, warm weight pressed against his back. A distant explosion rumbled, accompanied by the pop of small arms fire. Smoke stung his eyes. He walked on. There was no going back now. Explosions shook the ground as Brian rushed through the ruined streets, Raxor's frail body cradled against his chest. He ducked into a crumbling building, pressing against the wall to avoid a patrolling human squad. Raxor whimpered softly, her large eyes wide with fear. Brian held a finger to his lips, silently urging her to stay quiet. Once the patrol passed, Brian crept forward, scanning for any signs of danger. A group of hostile Trill emerged from the shadows, brandishing crude weapons. Brian set Raxor down gently, whispering, "Stay here, kid. I'll handle this." He engaged the attackers, his combat training kicking in. Brian disarmed the first Trill with a swift kick, then whirled to block a blow from another. The fight was brutal but brief, Brian's skills outmatching the desperate aliens. Breathing hard, Brian returned to Raxor, scooping her up once more. "We need to find you some new clothes," he muttered, eyeing her tattered garments. They scavenged through abandoned homes until Brian located a small Trill jumpsuit that would help Raxor blend in. As they pressed on, Raxor began to cough and shiver violently. Her condition was worsening, the stress of their escape taking its toll. Brian cursed under his breath, realizing he needed to find medicine fast. Risking exposure, Brian approached a bombed-out Trill clinic. He rummaged through the debris until he found a vial of vivid blue liquid, a powerful Trill antibiotic. Brian injected Raxor with the drug, praying it would be compatible with her biology. While waiting for the medicine to take effect, Brian asked Raxor about her people. The girl spoke of the Trill's peaceful ways and the incredible psychic gifts some of them possessed. As if on cue, a toppled metal beam suddenly levitated, surrounded by a shimmering aura. Raxor gasped, realizing she had caused it. Brian's eyes widened, knowing Raxor's powers were surfacing. Just then, armed Trill materialized from the ruins, their weapons trained on Brian and Raxor. The lead rebel, a grizzled male, spoke firmly. "We've been watching you, human. We know what the child is. She belongs with us." Brian aimed his rifle at the rebel, shielding Raxor. "I'm not handing her over to anybody. She's under my protection." The rebel leader shook his head. "You don't understand. Raxor is the key to our salvation. Her powers could turn the tide against your kind's invasion. Would you really keep her from her destiny?" Brian faltered, torn between his duty and the rebel's words. He looked down at Raxor, who clung to him in fear. In that moment, Brian made his choice. "Her destiny is what she chooses, not what anyone tells her. I'm getting her out of here, away from this damned war." The rebel sighed, lowering his weapon. "I can see your bond with the child is strong. Very well, take this." He handed Brian a data chip. "It contains maps of secret tunnels leading to the spaceport. Use them well." Brian nodded curtly, pocketing the chip. As they walked away, he couldn't shake the rebels' words about the war. Seeing the suffering and destruction firsthand, Brian began to question everything he had fought for. They eventually reached the spaceport, but getting to Brian's ship would be their most dangerous trial yet. Checkpoints lined the way, manned by alert soldiers. Brian took a deep breath, then approached the first guard post. "Sergeant Mason, 5th Infantry," Brian declared, praying his credentials hadn't been flagged yet. "Transporting precious cargo for command." The guard eyed him suspiciously. "What's your authorization code?" Brian rattled off a string of numbers, holding his breath. After a tense pause, the guard waved him through. They repeated the nerve-wracking process at 2 more checkpoints, each time Brian spinning a fragile web of half-truths and bluffs. At last, Brian's ship came into view, but as they approached, alarms started blaring across the spaceport. Brian cursed, realizing they'd been discovered. He sprinted for the ship, Raxor bouncing in his arms. Laser blasts scorched the ground at their heels. Brian charged up the loading ramp, slamming the controls to seal the hatch. He raced to the cockpit, frantically flipping switches to power up the engines. Raxor strapped into the co-pilot seat, her eyes wide. The ship lurched as it lifted off, narrowly evading the soldiers pouring into the hangar. Brian punched the thrusters, rocketing away from the planet's surface. As they cleared the atmosphere, he finally allowed himself to breathe. "We made it, kid," Brian said, grinning at Raxor. "But I'm afraid the hard part is just beginning." He set course for Earth, knowing that smuggling an alien child onto his xenophobic homeworld would be a daunting challenge. Brian glanced at Raxor, sensing the psychic power emanating from her small frame. Keeping her gifts hidden would be even tougher. But as Brian looked into Raxor's trusting eyes, he knew he would face any danger to keep her safe. The battle-scarred soldier and the orphaned alien girl had forged an unbreakable bond, one that would carry them through whatever trials lay ahead. Brian's heart pounded as he guided his ship through Earth's atmosphere, Raxor clinging tightly to his arm. The bustling cityscape of New Houston sprawled below them, a maze of gleaming skyscrapers and crowded streets. "We need to stay low and quiet," Brian murmured, steering toward the outskirts. "No one can know you're here." They touched down in an abandoned lot, shrouded by the hulks of derelict factories. Brian led Raxor through shadowy alleys, dodging security drones and keeping to the margins of society. His small apartment stood in a rundown block, perfect for lying low. Inside, Brian quickly set up a makeshift bed for Raxor, scrounging supplies from his meager belongings. "It's not much, but it'll do for now," he said, handing her a threadbare blanket. Raxor's eyes widened as she took in her new surroundings. A data pad slid off the table, hovering briefly before clattering to the floor. Brian tensed, realizing her powers were growing stronger. "We've got to be careful," he warned. "No using your abilities, okay? It's too dangerous." Days passed as Brian snuck out for food and basic necessities. He returned one evening to find cushions floating around the living room, Raxor giggling as she directed their movements. "Raxor, stop!" Brian hissed, closing the blinds. "Someone could see!" The cushions dropped instantly. Raxor's face fell. "I'm sorry. I was just practicing." Brian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, kid, but we can't risk it. I'll figure out a way for you to use your powers safely, I promise." A sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. Brian motioned for Raxor to hide as he approached cautiously. "Mason, open up!" a gruff voice called. Brian recognized it instantly. Commander Vance. "Just a second, sir," Brian called, his mind racing. He opened the door a crack, blocking the view inside. "What can I do for you, Commander?" Vance's eyes narrowed. "There have been reports of unusual activity in this area. Mind if I take a look around?" Brian's pulse quickened. "Now's not a great time, sir. Place is a mess. How about tomorrow?" Vance studied him for a long moment. "All right, Mason, but I'll be back. Something's not right here." As the commander's footsteps faded, Brian slumped against the door in relief. This was getting too close. They needed a new plan. Weeks passed, and Raxor's health improved dramatically. Her bubbly personality emerged, filling the apartment with laughter despite their precarious situation. Brian found himself growing deeply attached to the young Trill, marveling at her resilience and curiosity about Earth. One night, Raxor woke screaming from a vivid nightmare. "I saw them, Brian," she sobbed. "My people. They're fighting back against the humans, but they need help." Brian held her close, conflicted. He wanted to nurture her gifts, but knew the danger they posed. "We'll find a way to help them," he promised, "but we have to be smart about it." Their time was running out. Vance's surprise inspections became more frequent, and Brian barely managed to keep Raxor hidden. The final straw came when he was caught smuggling medical supplies from the base. Vance cornered him in an alley. "I don't know what you're mixed up in, Mason, but it ends now. I'm searching your apartment, and that's an order." Brian's mind raced as they approached his door. Just as Vance reached for the handle, a strange calm washed over him. He turned to Brian, blinking in confusion. I must have made a mistake," Vance muttered. "Carry on, soldier." As the commander walked away, Brian caught a glimpse of Raxor peeking through the window, her eyes glowing faintly. He knew then that they couldn't stay on Earth any longer. While Brian scrambled to arrange their escape, military brass debated how to counter the growing Trill resistance. General Brock thumped his hand on the table. "We need an edge," he growled. "If the rumors are true about a Trill child with advanced abilities, we must secure her at all costs." Vance shifted uncomfortably, realizing the implications of what he'd seen. His report had inadvertently confirmed Raxor's existence. Brian worked tirelessly, calling in favors to secure false identities and a small spacecraft. Just as they prepared to leave, alarms blared throughout the city. Vance and a squad of soldiers surrounded the apartment. "Come out, Mason," Vance shouted. "We know about the girl." Laser fire erupted as Brian and Raxor made a break for their ship. Bullets whizzed past, scorching the pavement at their feet. Suddenly, the soldiers' weapons flew from their hands, clattering uselessly to the ground. Raxor stood with her arms outstretched, eyes blazing with psychic energy. The soldiers stumbled back in shock. Vance stared at the young Trill, finally understanding the gravity of the situation. "Go," he said quietly to Brian. "I'll cover for you, just keep her safe." Brian nodded gratefully, ushering Raxor into the ship. As they blasted off into the night sky, he set a course for the outer colonies where reports placed the Trill resistance. "We're going to help your people," Brian told Raxer as Earth shrank behind them, "and maybe find a way to end this war." Raxer smiled, a small object orbiting her head as her powers continued to grow. Their journey was just beginning, but for the first time in a long while, Brian felt hope for the future. Brian guided their small ship through the asteroid field surrounding Tanzia, his hand steady on the controls despite his racing heart. Raxor sat beside him, her eyes closed in concentration as she reached out with her mind, scanning for any signs of pursuit. "I think we're clear," she said, opening her eyes, "but I sense something, a presence. It feels familiar." Brian nodded, setting the ship down in a secluded ravine. "That'll be our contact. Stay sharp, kid." They disembarked, Brian's hand never far from his blaster as they made their way to the designated meeting point. A hooded figure emerged from the shadows, hands raised. "The stars shine bright on Trill Prime," the figure said. Brian replied with the countersign, "but brighter still in free hearts." The figure lowered his hood, revealing the striking features of a male Trill. "I am Breedax. You took quite a risk coming here, human." "Name's Brian. This is Raxer. We're here to help." Breedax's eyes narrowed. "And why should we trust you?" Before Brian could respond, a nearby boulder lifted into the air, suspended by an ethereal blue glow. Raxer's eyes blazed with psychic energy as she effortlessly manipulated the massive rock. Breedax's jaw dropped. "By the spirits, it's true. The child of prophecy." He led them to a hidden bunker where other Trill rebels waited. Brian recounted their harrowing escape from Earth as Breedax listened intently. "With Raxer's abilities, we might stand a chance," Breedax said. "But she'll need training, intensive training." Brian bristled. "She's just a kid. I won't let you turn her into a weapon." Raxer tugged at Brian's sleeve. "I want to help, Brian. This is my fight, too." Brian looked into her determined eyes, seeing the same fire that had driven him to protect her in the first place. He sighed, turning to Breedax. "We do this on my terms. Her safety comes first, always." Breedax nodded solemnly. "Agreed. We'll begin tomorrow." Over the next months, Raxer's powers grew exponentially. She learned to lift entire vehicles with her mind, to read thoughts from a distance, to create psychic shields. Brian watched with a mix of pride and apprehension, always there to offer support when the strain became too much. One night, after a particularly grueling session, Raxer collapsed into Brian's arms, sobbing. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Brian held her tight. "You're the strongest person I know, kid. We'll get through this together." As Raxer's training progressed, the human military closed in. Commander Vance, now stripped of rank, stood before General Brock in a Spartan office. "You disobeyed direct orders, Vance," Brock growled, "but you're the only one who's gotten close to the asset. I'm giving you one chance at redemption. Bring me the girl." Vance swallowed hard, conflicted. "Yes, sir." Elite strike teams fanned out across the galaxy, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. On Tanzia, Brian and Raxer had just finished another training session when alarms blared throughout the rebel base. "They found us!" Breedax shouted, rushing into the room. "We need to evacuate now." Explosions rocked the complex as human forces breached the outer defenses. Brian and Raxor raced through chaotic corridors, rebels scrambling all around them. "Get to the main hangar," Breedax ordered, directing his lieutenants. "We'll hold them off." In the hangar, Raxer unleashed her powers. Crates and debris flew at the incoming soldiers, knocking them off their feet. Brian provided covering fire, his aim true as ever. But then a high-pitched whine filled the air. Raxer screamed, clutching her head as her powers flickered and died. "Psychic disruptors!" Brian yelled, scooping up the girl and sprinting for the last transport. Breedax appeared at the ramp, blaster fire peppering the ground around him. "Go, I'll buy you time." "Breedax, no!" Raxor cried, reaching out as Brian pulled her aboard. The transport lifted off, Breedax's last stand fading from view as they shot into the sky. Brian held Raxor close as she wept, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "We'll make this right," he promised. For Breedax, for all of them. As the stars streaked by, Brian knew their fight was not nearly finished. But with Raxor at his side, he dared to hope they might just have a chance. The battered transport limped into the asteroid field, its hull scorched and smoking from the narrow escape. Inside, Brian slumped against the bulkhead, his face etched with grief and exhaustion. Beside him, the remaining Trill rebels tended to their wounds in grim silence. They docked at a hidden outpost carved into the heart of a massive asteroid. As the airlock hissed open, Brian stumbled out, his legs barely supporting him. A grizzled Trill fighter caught his arm. "Easy there, human," she said. "You look like hell." Brian managed a weak nod. "Tanzia, it's gone. We lost so many." The rebel base buzzed with frantic activity. Medics rushed to treat the wounded while technicians pored over damage reports. In a makeshift command center, Brian found himself face to face with the remnants of the Trill leadership. "We can't give up," Raxor insisted, her eyes blazing with defiance. "There has to be a way to strike back." An older Trill shook his head. "Child, look around you. Our numbers are decimated. Our resources nearly depleted. What hope do we have against the full might of the human military?" Raxor paced, her mind racing. Suddenly she froze, a spark of inspiration lighting her face. "The research facility on Epsilon 9. That's where they're developing countermeasures against our abilities. If we could infiltrate it, sabotage their work." Brian's gut clenched. "Raxor, no, it's too dangerous. That place will be a fortress." "But with my powers, we might have a chance," Raxor argued. "Think about it, Brian. If they perfect those countermeasures, it's over for all of us." Brian saw the fire in her eyes, the same dedication that had kept them alive this far. He sighed, knowing he couldn't dissuade her. "All right, kid, but we do this smart. No unnecessary risks." Days blurred into weeks as they planned their assault. Brian drilled Raxor relentlessly, honing her abilities to a razor's edge. Finally, under the cover of an asteroid storm, their stealth ship slipped past the facility's outer defenses. They breached an airlock, Raxor's eyes glowing as she manipulated the locking mechanisms with her mind. Alarms blared, and Brian's blaster sang out as guards poured into the corridor. Raxor thrust out her hands, sending a wave of force that bowled over their attackers. They fought their way deeper into the complex, Raxor's powers growing more precise with each encounter. Security doors crumpled like paper before her telekinetic assault. Brian watched in awe as she deftly manipulated computer systems, bypassing firewalls with a thought. At last, they reached the primary research vault. Brian's blood ran cold as he saw the rows of stasis pods, each containing a Trill test subject. Tubes and wires snaked from their bodies, feeding data to banks of humming machinery. "Those bastards!" Brian snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before they could act, a searing pain lanced through Raxor's mind. She screamed, collapsing to her knees as an agonizing psionic field filled the air. Through the haze of agony, she saw General Brock himself step into view, flanked by heavily armed troops. "Did you really think we wouldn't be prepared for you?" Brock sneered. Brian's mind raced, seeing Raxor writhe in torment. In that moment, he made the hardest choice of his life. He triggered the explosives they'd planted along the way, burying them all in the collapsing vault. "I'm sorry, kid," he whispered, tears stinging his eyes as he fled the imploding facility. Behind him, in the chaos of falling debris and spreading fires, Raxor marshaled the last of her strength. With a final, searing psychic lash, she obliterated the countermeasure's power source. The psionic field died, and with it, her connection to Brian winked out. Brian staggered to his ship, his mind echoing with the sudden, deafening silence where Raxor's presence had always been. As he punched in the launch sequence with shaking hands, he was haunted by one agonizing question. Had he just sacrificed everything they'd fought for?
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.